I'd like to welcome everybody who is returning to our events and welcome to everybody who decided to join us for the first time. Today we are starting a series of webinars. There will be 2 total, where we will be discussing about relationship between law enforcement and journalists, about cooperation, potential conflicts, potential sources of information. And I'm very pleased that today we are joined by Karen Greenaway, those who attended the course remember, and Karen will be presenting today with Jean Pierrot, and they will be presenting in 3 lectures, different materials to you. And what I would like to ask you to do before I'll continue my presentation of the faculty tonight, after each lecture, which you will hear, please use Q&A to ask your questions. And all these questions will be addressed after each lecture. And then at the end of 3 lectures, which we'll have today, you will be able to ask additional questions or express your opinion, make suggestions or comments. So tonight with us will be also Sherry and Walter and Peter. And they will be helping to answer some of your questions. If it would be possible and if you would have enough of them. So welcome back, and Karen, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on journalists and law enforcement. I'm going to start this portion of the webinar to talk about that sort of interactions. I was very careful about the word I selected between law enforcement and journalists, because I know journalists hate the word collaboration, and of course, law enforcement is very wary of the word cooperation. So I stuck with just the interaction between those two jobs. For this webinar, like I said, we're going to focus on the investigator's perspective in working with in these interactions, and then the next webinar is going to talk to it from the prosecutor's perspective. And how we, live in the space of investigating and reporting on crime and criminal activity and the people who commit those acts in such a way that there are sometimes overlap in a lot of different ways, and we're going to focus on those different ways. So let me share my screen here and start out with just kind of an overview in talking about this interaction. So as you see at the bottom, the kind of the subheading of this is, how do we engage and interact to protect both the rights of the accused and the right to free speech? And those are, that question there is going to run the theme of this presentation for both webinars. And we'll go into those a little bit as we move through the lectures. So what are the common interactions? Well, first of all, a journalist is doing a story and he or she wants to have validation or commentary on a report. Very common. Another one is, what if a journalist does a story and law enforcement uses that story to open or further a case? It happens quite frequently, particularly in the corruption arena, but it is not a universal, law enforcement doesn't universally have the ability to do that. I have actually presented and trained law enforcement in the EU that cannot use a journalist reporting to open investigation. And, if you attended our first course, one of the things that I did make very clear is that we can't just take your story, of course, and put it in a case and say, well, everything in this story justifies opening an investigation. Law enforcement still has to do independent validation before they would use your reporting. The journalist, another interaction, a journalist wants more information from law enforcement. They're doing a story which law enforcement is already has an investigation on. And so they go to, the organization and to obtain additional information. Not an uncommon practice is the journalist as a law enforcement informant. And we'll talk about those interactions. We talk about journalists as sources, or a journalist or a civil activist wants to provide intelligence about a crime or person who has committed a crime to law enforcement. When I was in the International Corruption Unit at FBI, we on occasion would have journalists or civil activists who would come to us who would say, I've written this story or we've done this report. We have more information to support this report, but the allegations in here are about a kleptocrat committing a crime, and we want to give you this intelligence. Or law enforcement goes to a journalist and asks the journalist to give them information. And usually that's based on what a journalist has reported. But also it's generally that the law enforcement officer wants the source of the journalist reporting and not, of course, just the report itself. And then finally, journalists use data or intelligence leaked from legally protected government databases to write a story. And we will have, Sherry will be talking about the FinCEN files as an example of that interaction. So let's start with journalists request validation or commentary on a story. This is from an article that I found this summer from the Washington Post. And the title of the article is "Journalists Are Re-Examining Their Reliance on a Longtime Source, the Police." And the issue, of course, is in the United States this summer, we saw a number of protests surrounding deaths of Black men in the United States. And of course, the first report that comes out when it is the police who is accused of killing, a Black man or anybody, is that the police issue a press release or give some sort of statement about what occurred in that situation. And the story gives two different perspectives on using that statement from the police. A woman by Susan Chira says, that journalists should treat the police like any other source, with the same degree of skepticism as you treat any other source, and that as a result, they should do the same kind of validation that you would do from any other source. And as she points out, just because the police said it does not mean it's necessarily true. You still must verify and corroborate the information. And she points out that just because a source wears a badge and has a gun doesn't mean that they are speaking to you truthfully. The flip side of that debate is an individual by the name of Chuck Wexler pointed out, he is with the Police Executive Research Forum, that when the police give you that first statement about, any type of criminal activity that has notoriety, is that they are also in the same sort of rush as as a journalist is, trying to get the information out to the public, and they're going to make mistakes, and that they don't necessarily, they aren't lying because they've learned that they should not lie. But at the same time, the police are under a great deal of pressure because there's a lot of technology that's around that's recording sometimes these incidents, and putting a different spin on what occurred than what the police may know at the time that the situation comes down. So different sides of, getting that information from the police, when there's an ongoing criminal activity. And the issue here is that the police have to balance, and journalists have to balance this too, to a certain extent, is we have, people who we have accused of a crime. We have people who are witnesses to a crime. And we have people who we may accuse who may turn out to be innocent. In the investigations that I have done, for example, especially when you're doing transnational organized crime cases, as I have done, oftentimes you get people who are a part of, appear to be part of a criminal organization that may actually not be a member of the organization. And part of the way that, investigations are conducted is if somebody turns out to be, not guilty of the crime we're investigating, or they are, an innocent member of the, of the organization, that is why then the investigation will not charge them with a crime, and we will close our investigation into the alleged criminal activity as it relates to those individuals. But at the same time, once we come out and we accuse somebody and we put, we file and we do an arrest warrant in the United States and a number of other countries, including some of your countries as well, there are certain rights that that attaches to the accused. And Peter Sprung, who is on this webinar, will talk about that on next week, that come into play as law enforcement proceeds with the process of obtaining a conviction against that individual. At the same time, in the United States, and again, in a number of other countries, freedom of speech is protected in our Constitution. And while there are limitations on, as it relates to the truth and veracity of information that you give in the press, we and in law enforcement have to be careful about what we say at any point in time during our investigations and after the investigations, even after the persons are convicted, which may come into, as the press may see it, conflict with a journalist's reporting. Oops, sorry. So remember, we're talking about here, you're the journalist, you want to get information from the police about, or the FBI about an ongoing investigation. And I took this exactly from the FBI's website, and it says, can I obtain detailed information about an FBI case that I see in the news? And the first answer, of course, is no. I was frequently asked, by journalists, I've been asked even post my time in the FBI, whether I could ask the FBI if they're doing the investigation. And the answer is no, I can't. Now that I am retired, I'm just like any other member of the public as far as the FBI is concerned. And when we do make disclosures of information, when the FBI does, Sherry worked for the Secret Service, Peter worked for the Department of Justice, Walter worked for the Internal Revenue Service. We all have policies which are in place, which deal with our interactions with journalists, and what we can say and what we cannot say at all times during an investigation. And even to the point of, we cannot admit or deny whether there is the existence of an investigation. There have been some notable exceptions where the FBI stepped forward in a number of years ago in going outside of that policy. It was highly controversial within the FBI and outside the FBI that they actually did that. But in general, the policy is that the FBI, Department of Justice, makes no comment while, as to the existence of investigation or the ongoing, if an investigation should come out in the public. For example, this summer, there was a very high profile investigation into Ukrainian oligarch. that came out in the public when the FBI executed search warrants in 2 locations in the United States. Even after that came out in the public, the FBI and Department of Justice make no further comment on the case, even though the public is now aware of it, which is what they have put here on their website when it comes to giving out material to the press. So let's go to then the situation where we have law enforcement who uses a journalist reporting to open or further a case. And I've used an example that I am personally familiar with called the Red Flex camera investigation. And it was something that came up while I was still in the FBI. And I'm commenting on it now only because I know that it's been fully adjudicated in multiple countries. And the case is called the Red Flex camera case, camera investigation. So Red Flex is a company. It's headquartered in Australia. It does have offices in different countries, including the United States. One of the things that Red Flex does is they have designed and created cameras that can be posted for road safety. So, for example, they can be posted at intersections to see if people go through, a light that beyond the time that they're supposed to. And then what would happen is the camera takes a picture and the camera then sends that information to an enforcement agency wherever the camera is located. And then the person who owns the vehicle gets a ticket. They are not universally accepted in the United States. Some states have decided that they are unconstitutional. But Red Flex has enough of a demand for these cameras around the world, and the red light camera is not the only one, as you can see from this. Speed cameras are another one. Cameras to if there's issue at an intersection, cameras to notify back to the people who handle the road safety signs to let them know there's an issue at an intersection. So monitoring, the operation of safety equipment. And then they have other activities involving, the enforcement of laws. So why would a city or a state put these cameras in? And the answer is because, having a camera at an intersection allows it frees up the time of a police officer to do other things, investigate other crimes. So we're not making the police responsible for the most basic traffic safety as well as investigations. Now, in some of your countries, of course, you have a separate traffic police that do this. In the United States, we don't have a separate traffic police. The police are road safety investigators. They handle all kinds of police enforcement. So the case started when a very one of the largest newspapers in the United States, called the Chicago Tribune, started to poll the publicly available information about the violations that were being sent out thanks to these red light cameras. And what they noticed when they polled these, and you'll see there were 4 million violations that this journalist organization reviewed. They noticed that there were suspicions pattern in dozens of intersections about how the system was maintained and managed. And they then went from reporting on the suspicions related to the way the system was managed to looking at how the system was procured in the first place. And in the city of Chicago, Illinois, one of our major cities in the United States, of course, the system had been procured by the city council, but it did not go through the traditional fair and balanced procurement, transparent procurement process. there was a suspicious set of circumstances that the Chicago Tribune found that identified that one city councilman in coordination with a city manager had basically hijacked the procurement process to make sure that Red Flex obtained the contract to set up these cameras. And underneath that, the quote from the Chicago Tribune, what you will see is that the headline as to what happened. I know, and it's now been released publicly, that the Chicago Tribune's work led to two things: a referral to the Inspector General for the city of Chicago, which is basically an individual that looks at all of the way that Chicago's procurement process works and can bring criminal charges and fines if you violate those processes. And it was also referred to the FBI. And the FBI opened an investigation after they validated the information that the Chicago Tribune had obtained. And that case led to charges, public corruption charges in the United States. And that's the headline underneath there, that the CEO of this company, Red Flex in the United States, and an ex-Chicago official were indicted for rigging the red light camera. But not just the city official, which was John Bills. You can see that he received $2 million in bribes over a period of 10 years in order to award this contract to Red Flex. But Red Flex, because it was an Australian company that had paid a bribe outside of its country, Australia, to obtain this contract, was investigated by the Australian Federal Police for their version of violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. As well as the Department of Justice in the United States opened an investigation against Red Flex for paying bribes in the United States and then potentially in other countries. And in addition to the charges that were brought against the former CEO, as well as this city official, there were other charges that were brought against other individuals in the United States and elsewhere related to this procurement fraud scheme. And the scheme was exposed by the Chicago Tribune. So it goes to show you that, the police, the kind of the takeaway for this when you're doing a report is that the police are paying attention. The police do look and see and use your information, as they progress, through their investigations. And unfortunately for all of you, you may never get credited for it. But it does go to show you that, that when you are doing that report, regardless of whether the police are telling you or not, that there certainly is, more cases than I could possibly name, particularly large corruption cases in the United States, that there is that interaction between journalists and the police where law enforcement has used that your information in order to open an investigation. So that's my so that's the first part all of the talking about those interactions. I was Walter, can I put you on the spot, to give just a brief example of an investigation that you either opened or used journalist reporting in order to open?
Sure, no problem at all. Are you there? Okay.
Yes.
Now, this case occurred back when I was a field agent working out in Dallas, Texas. So it began with a story that I noticed in the paper about a local insurance company that appeared to be growing very quickly. And the owners of the company were, the journalists did a very good job in tracking some assets and the fact that the company went from 0 to 60 in a period of about 4 months, 4 or 5 months, which is, if you're going to develop an insurance company or start an insurance company, everybody knows that that's probably a very quick turnaround in order to start funding for one, get the approvals, and then get a business up and going, and then start getting premiums. And what happened is the journalist had discovered that even though the corporation was located in the state of Texas, the actual all the assets were actually located in southern Louisiana. And so it even raised some more flags. So when the story broke, it was very kind of a basic story about how an insurance company grew from nothing overnight to basically they were accepting and writing insurance premiums for Walmart, which is, was a very, large company. And it was, so again, it piqued my interest. And so what I did was started an investigation in this insurance company based on this story. And the journalists were actually, they didn't provide anything as far as sources or any kind of information in that matter, but they did have information that they were willing to provide to me. So again, it pointed me in a very good direction. It took me into southern Louisiana, which took us all the way to the government, the governor's mansion at that time, into the cabinet's post, and we discovered that there was a large amount of robbery that went on with individuals with the Louisiana Insurance Commission in order to give this company an insurance license. And as it went on, this was kind of an ongoing relationship at the time that me and the journalist had, in that he was developing information. He would feed me when he had something that he located. He would actually provide some documentation and information to me as well. Again, you have to realize, like Karen said, at that time I had no way to provide him anything back. I was not prepared or able to. It was what is violation of our Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division regulations for me to talk to him, but I could accept information that was provided by them to me, and they were a very big help because, as you know, this journalist was very dogged about looking into this company, and whenever he found out that it was possibly tied to the governor of Louisiana, it made it more so to him. So he spent quite a bit of time on this story, as you can imagine. And this investigation went on for probably, I hate to say it, but probably for about 3 years, off and on. At one point we did a number of search warrants that was provided. We went in literally in one case, whenever we went in to talk to the president of the company, I was knocking on the front door and he was literally diving out the back door, getting into his car and leaving. And that's a true story. We found out afterwards. I'm knocking on his front door and he's leaving out the back door. And he went immediately to New York City, got on the Concorde at the time, if you remember that. Maybe some of y'all might be too young to remember it, but the Concorde would fly from New York City to London, England in a few hours. And as a side point, he would do this routinely just to take his girlfriends over to London for dinner and come back. So that's the amount of money that this individual would make. So he stayed in various countries in Europe for about a year and a half. And luckily, our friends at the FBI were able to do a sting on him when he ran out of money and told him that he had some additional funds coming to him in the form of a check that he needed to come and pick up. So he did, and of course the FBI arrested him and returned him to the United States, and he was prosecuted, and he got about 20 years in jail from what my recollection was for this. But again, the journalists were very instrumental in that case. I would not have started this investigation without that story, probably, because I was sitting around in the morning, drinking a cup of coffee, reading the paper, saw this story, thought, wow, this looks interesting. And sure enough, I spent probably about a week, a month in New Orleans for almost a year and a half. So I got some nice travel out of it, and the journalists, I'm sure, got some nice travel out of it, and everybody enjoyed themselves. But yeah, but again, Not at one point could I tell him anything of what was going on, but it did not detract him from doing his job. And he was more than willing to provide documents that he could provide. He would never give me his sources, which was fine. I didn't never really ask for them. You know, he would say that if somebody said that they wanted to talk to me, that he would provide my name to them and contact info. And I did have individuals call me, you know, to talk about this person. So and the company. But again, I never would ask, and I could not provide tell him that what my actual investigative steps were. But it ended up being very lucrative. We did end up putting the insurance commissioner in jail, you know, for bribery, fraud. We did not get the governor at the time. He was kind of insulated. And so it was a very, you know, very good case. And that's just one of many that I've actually started from a story that I've read in the paper. So again, from my standpoint, I picked up numerous articles in the newspaper and began investigations, which have led to numerous indictments, seizures, you name it, from a journalist story. Very cooperative. Try to be very professional with them. Just very pleasant. You know, it's always good to cultivate a relationship, and it worked out for me over the years many times. So again, thank you, and I appreciate all the job you all do. Is that good?
Haya, do we have any questions in the chat?
No, Karen, apparently your lecture was so straightforward that there are no questions. And on this positive note, I'd like to ask Jean Pirot to tell us, Antonazzo, to tell us about journalists seeking information from law enforcement about ongoing criminal matters.
Thank you very much. I would like to say hello to everybody, all the attendees of the course we just finished, and also the new attendees for this webinar. For those who don't know me, I'm from Italy. I used to work for the Italian Guardia di Finanza, that is the financial police in Italy. Spent almost more than 20 years working with them. And now I'm employed at the World Bank. I'm a senior investigator at the anti-corruption department of the World Bank, let's say. So I would like to continue on the same line that Karen was describing when talking about cooperation between, or interaction, we would say, between law enforcement and journalists. I, as a police officer, my experience in Italy working as a police officer, the official policy, also for us, also for the law enforcement in Italy, and mostly for all the civil law jurisdictions, is that normally, law enforcement does not disclose to journalists whether or not an investigation is ongoing. And that's because, to protect the confidentiality of the investigation. The same thing is for us at the World Bank. We don't do that because that may impact on the confidentiality of the investigation and then on the investigation itself. So if a journalist is trying to access a police officer and ask if the investigation is going, the best case scenario of an answer would be a no comment. However, in the civil law jurisdictions, where the prosecutor is the leader of the investigation, so the police is basically following the directions of the prosecutors on a specific investigation. What normally happens in those jurisdictions, Italy being one of them, is that at some point during the investigation, there is a moment where the prosecutor and the police together, they decided to basically go public and declare that there is an ongoing investigation, and also, what is the investigation about, at least general information of the investigation. And that is because at some point, the investigation has already reached the level where there is enough evidence to corroborate the allegations and to even conduct, for example, searches of premises, house premises or offices of a company, for example, and maybe arrest people that are responsible for those allegations. At the moment, and normally what happens, the arrest is something that happens very early in the morning. So the police officer would go and knock on the door of the subject people and arrest them and take them to jail, basically, very early in the morning. On the same day, the prosecutor and people from the police, they would arrange a coordinated press conference, and they would inform everybody, and the journalists there, they would normally invite the journalists to join the press conference and communicate the information, what information can be communicated at the point about the investigation. And the reason for that is because if people are being arrested and taken to jail, of course it's a kind of a public fact that is already ongoing, and at that moment, there is a need, of course, to communicate what's going on to the general public and to journalists in that specific instance. And then you will see the news, published on the media, on the major outlets on television, and the like. However, there are also other cases where, and I had specific experience on that, where the journalists may ask police to comment on, for example, the general condition of the general environment of a specific theme where the journalist is working, is writing a story or is running a story. For example, when in my previous experience with the Italian Guardia di Finanza, I was sent to work in Kosovo, and I was the deputy head of the financial investigation unit in Kosovo. That unit had the task to conduct corruption investigations, investigations on corruption within the UN administration in Kosovo. That was around 2003, 2004. So at that time, Kosovo was not an independent country as it is now. It was under the administration of the United Nations. They had a very big mission there, United Nations. It is still called, because it's still up and running, but in much smaller size. It was called United Nations Mission in Kosovo, and it was the largest mission that the United Nations had throughout the world in terms of budget, in terms of people employed in that mission, in that UN mission, also both international staff and local staff. And of course, when there is a big budget, big money involved, there is also a problem with corruption, because that money may be used for not intended purposes and may be still stolen. Therefore, the UN asked the help to the Italian government to send people that were investigators that were specialized in corruption investigations. And I was the deputy head of that task force. It was made up only by Guardia di Finanza officers. A journalist that was interested in covering a story on the United Nations in general. So they wanted to highlight, let's say, the criticisms of UN missions throughout the world. They were running a story on, all the UN world in general. So, starting from the Secretariat in New York, but also, several missions throughout the world. And eventually they came to Kosovo, where I was working, and they sent me a request to give an interview for this story that they were covering. And this was as a part of a very famous, at least in Italy, investigative journalist transmission, TV transmission that is called The Report. And they covered all these scandals in Italy mainly, because it's, of course, mainly followed by Italian people, on corruption, fraud, but also homicides, all sorts of crimes. And they're very, very skilled and very talented investigative journalists who are working there. So I received this request from the journalists, and of course I cannot deal with that directly. And that's like the limitation of a police officer, where a single police officer will never take a decision to talk directly with a journalist. That's not up to him. If he does that, it's going to be in big trouble. What he needs to do is he needs to ask authorization from the managers, usually at the central level of the police force, be authorized to talk and to and also agreed on what to say to the journalists, because not all information may be released, as we already have discussed. And so I did that. I asked my central headquarters in Rome to be authorized to talk with journalists, and they gave me the authorization. And I sat in the in front of his camera and was filming me and asking him questions. Not all of the questions were agreed upon, but I told him whatever I could, and that was part of the story that he was running. In the end, the story went on the air, and was a very good service, because UN is a big organization and has a lot of problems, as all the big organizations. So his interest was in highlighting and pointing out all these criticisms. And my job in Kosovo was to work on those criticisms. Subject of our investigations were also international staff working for the UN. And eventually we also arrested some of those international staff, and they were also prosecuted in their own countries. So he was very interesting to hear all that story, and that was part of his final product. But also other ways that I think the journalists, good investigative journalists, can influence positively in the work of the police. And I was actually, this is another Italian transmission that I follow from the States, where I am right now. There's also a very good investigative journalist TV show that is called, in Italian, it's called Chi l'ha visto, which means who saw that. So basically, there is this journalist in her studio, is the woman in her studio, that they run stories on everything, even missing persons, homicides, missing persons who later are discovered to be killed, and they basically talk to the entire population and ask them to come out and tell things that they have saw on this specific case. So, for example, they publish a picture of a person that has gone missing, and they ask people, who saw this, the person that may be in trouble, it may be in a temporary situation where he doesn't know where he's going because of some sickness that this person may be subject to, or simply because the person has been kidnapped. And so they asked the general population to come on live on the air, because this is aired live, and call the people that are working for this transmission and tell what they saw. More or less like you see in the US, in the metro station, if you see something, say something. It's the same thing, but they do it on the air and live on television, which is very effective. And the police are watching also this transmission. So although there is not a direct contact with the police, the police, of course, as a part of the general population, they are also watching this transmission, this TV show, and they can receive the same information that everybody in that moment is receiving. And there is a very clear case of this good cooperation that can happen, that happened very lately. And I would like to share my screen at this point to show that to you. Give me a second here. Okay, so this that you may see at this moment is an article that came out on the press very recently, a couple of weeks ago, and so this is the transmission Chi l'ha visto. In English, you will translate it as "who saw it." This is, of course, a Google translation of the article. It's a translation in English, but the article was initially published in Italian. So this gentleman here, I would say this man because he's not really gentle, he started talking. It was at this point in this picture, you see he's talking to the journalist. And the story here is that there is his girlfriend who has gone missing, and nobody knows where she is, except that the brother of the girlfriend, whose name is Valentina here, the brother has received a text message that she was in a hospital, and she's now in a kind of a secret location, a safe and secret location. And Valentina told her brother to come to her to the hospital, but not to tell anything to this gentleman here. His name is Gabriele, and he's his boyfriend. Okay. So that's a kind of suspicion thing that the brother then goes to the TV show Kilavis and says, "Oh, help me find my sister because she's in trouble." She sent me this warning text that telling that she is maybe in danger, but nobody knows where she is. So the journalists, they go to Gabriele, to his house, and they start speaking to him, and he's trying to explain to the journalist here that. It's that night and they live together. Okay, Gabriele and Valentina live together. That night, I heard some noise outside the house. I went out. There were some animals. You may see that he lives in a kind of rural area here. There were some animals, and then I saw Valentina there, and she was all covered in blood. And I tried to help her. I tried to clean the blood, and I brought her to the hospital. That's the story that he says. Of course, it's not a very convincing story, and the journalists, keep asking him, keep bombarding him of, questions about details, what is really seen, how is the story goes, and there is also another girlfriend of this gentleman, Gabriele, who is next to him, and they're both talking together. And they're both talking to the journalists, and they're also answering questions that are coming in the TV show or live from from persons who know him or know Valentina, who know different things, and he's trying to answer all those very difficult questions. To cut along the story short, at the end, Valentina is found, and she was in a hospital. She was very badly beaten up. Assaulted by somebody, and now she's in a very safe location. It's called a kind of safe house. She's fine, but although she had very bad injuries from an assault that she received, and Gabriele is trying to say, actually trying to help her, but the relationship was very difficult. So at some point, after a couple of nights that they're discussing about this accident, Gabriele goes missing. He runs away. The journalists, they go to his house again because they want to continue talking to him, and he's not there. He's nowhere to be found. Now he's gone missing, right? So Kilavisto, the conductor of the TV show, they sent a kind of request to everybody who, at this point, who saw Gabriele around, on the territory of Italy, and to come out and tell where he may be. And sure enough, there is a video that comes out. I'm going to play this video for you. Now you can see. Vediamo prima Patrizia. So this is the girl, the other girlfriend of Gabriele, who lives with him. And this is our Gabriele, who's on the phone and doing his own business and his own things in another town. This is now in a very small town in the south of Italy. So the whole story was in Livorno, in Tuscany. Now Gabriele is in Italy, in the south of Italy, in this very small place called Ischitella. And I'm from the same region. I'm from Puglia region, which is where this town is. And I've never heard of this town. It's very small. It's like 4,000 inhabitant town. It's very small. But somebody was there, and somebody who was following this transmission saw Gabriele and sent that video to the TV show. They ran the video on live. We don't know whether the video was sent to the police or not, but the police was working, of course, under not very overtly, because Valentina, she had already, probably been interacting with the police at the point. But the police didn't know that Gabriele was, ran away and went to that small place. They knew when, the audience called the TV show, and they tell them that Gabriele is now in Puglia. And at the end of the story, Gabriele is arrested. Gabriele and Patrizia is the name of the second girlfriend. They are now both under arrest. So, the police went to that small town, they arrested him, and because Valentina told them that it was indeed Gabriele who assaulted her and who basically sent her to the hospital, and not that he actually was trying to help her, like he was trying to explain to the journalists. So this is a clear example of how journalists can actually, and influence positively and help police to conduct an investigation and to actually find people that, otherwise they would have never been found. On top of that, in this situation of COVID, you cannot really move freely in Italy, like in many other countries. So to go from Tuscany to Puglia in the south, it's about 1,000 kilometers, and definitely going through several regions, and nobody can move through region at the moment. But he just went, and as you also could see from the video, was not even wearing a mask. So it's not very law-abiding citizen, I would say. But definitely, it was helped. The police was helped by citizens and by the journalists who are running this story, and so helped the police to secure the alleged perpetrators at this point, because of course the investigation is still ongoing. But at least now Gabriele is not in position to go anywhere, and he will have to answer even tougher questions from the police at this point, and not only from the journalists. So this is my contribution. I know it's not a lot. It's not very overwhelming the disclosure for journalists, but I think it's a very good. It's a couple of very good inputs that may help you dealing and interacting with the police when you're running your stories. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. So I don't see any questions in the chat again. And I'll just make the offer to everyone, if you, after we get off today, or if you have a question for any one of the panelists individually, please, we're happy to answer your question individually. Or if you remember by the next webinar and you want to ask the question next time, please feel free to do that. So now we get to the more, we've gone through the interactions of, the police, or law enforcement using your information, you as a journalist trying to get information from the police about an ongoing matter. Now we're looking at, a more delicate interaction, and that is what happens when the police are using journalists as sources for their investigation. So, and I've titled this "Journalists as Law Enforcement Sources: The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly." For those of you who know the popular film, probably not, it's a pretty old film, but there are good ways in which journalists can become sources for law enforcement, like Walter spoke about. Another recent example that I would give, where journalists were contributing to law enforcement's work, is one of the major corruption cases out in the world right now. And that, if you're familiar with the 1MBD case out of Malaysia, journalists and civil activists both contributed greatly to the initiation and even some of the ongoing investigation that was done in that matter, where the US is up to something like seizing and forfeiting for the government, for the people of Malaysia, over $2 billion. And several individuals in the United States have been charged with crimes involving payments of bribes overseas, as well as other types of crimes, including fraud, fraud against the people of Malaysia. So basically, there are three types of journalist as source relationships. The first one is a formal relationship. And for those of you who have not attended our previous course, what we're talking about is the formal relationship that a police officer has with, or a law enforcement officer has with their sources. A significant number of agencies, even law enforcement agencies in your countries have a formal process for what we call signing up individuals to be informants or cooperators. There are policies and procedures that have been established internally in the United States to do that. In some of your countries, those relationships are actually regulated by your codes of criminal procedure. And when that formal relationship happens, there is some sort of exchange that's going to be ongoing and regular. The journalist, by being signed up as a source for a law enforcement agency, gets all of the protections that any other source gets, which means that we're not going to disclose your identity as a journalist, for example. If you are not going to cooperate or you're not going to testify in court, we will not disclose your identity as the provider of initial intelligence. And so there are protections that are given to the journalist who is willing to engage in this type of formal relationship. But particularly in the United States and some European Union countries, that formal relationship requires a lot of approvals. And so while I could, as a special agent in the FBI, develop a relationship with an informant who was the average citizen, and that approval would only to open, we would say, open that reporting file from that informant would just be, my supervisor would give that approval. In order to engage in that relationship with a journalist, as well as certain other highly protected individuals, a lawyer is another one who's an example. I need to have very high level approvals within the organization, just because that what the journalist does and a journalist's role, as I said, is protected by the US Constitution and is protected in a number of constitutions around the world. So it is only in that formal relationship that really the agency or the entity has the ability to protect the sources, or the journalist as source's identity. But what about the relationship that Walter talked about, the off the record relationship? When I was in the FBI up until about 2016, the press office in the FBI would arrange meetings with journalists where we were allowed to talk about background, not on our investigations, but on a topic, for example, that the journalists were writing on. So, so I was allowed, for example, to talk to, a journalist who's writing a story on money laundering. And give him, my experience as an investigator as it related to doing money laundering cases. And that relationship would be arranged by the press office in the FBI and would receive approval from within the FBI for us to engage in those discussions. But the challenge of that off the record relationship is that if during that time frame, when I'm talking, to the journalist on background, I, as a law enforcement officer, realize that the journalist has intelligence or evidence that could further an ongoing investigation, then the law enforcement officer has to document to their file. And, for those of you who took our course, we called those reports of investigation. Some of you may have heard of the U.S., the U.S. name for it called an FD 302, which is just a federal form number 302, which is where the FBI documents, its reports of investigation. And those reports of investigation with the name of the journalist, will go into the FBI's or the other agency's files. And so, already that does not create a protection for the journalist, because should that report be turned over have to be turned over in court, as a part of charging somebody with a crime, that will identify, of course, the journalist as the provider of this information. So, but regardless, after 2016 or so, the FBI changed its policy, and then there was no longer discussions on background with journalists without the approval of both the Department of Justice as well as the FBI's press office. And it was only in very limited cases. Now, that being said, are there still FBI and have there still been FBI agents who have had these off the record conversations with journalists? Absolutely. Are there law enforcement officers in law enforcement organizations outside of the FBI and other federal agencies that allow those discussions? Yes. So that is not a universal, not every law enforcement agency in the United States has taken that same position. For those of you who are familiar with what has happened in the United States in the last 4 years, you will understand why that policy change was made, particularly as it related to the FBI. But just because the FBI doesn't allow it doesn't mean that you as a journalist may not be able to talk to, for example, a police officer in New York City on a story that you're writing off, on background. But you should be cautious that in the course of that conversation, that law enforcement officer may have to do a report, about what it is you're discussing on background. But then you have the third interaction, which is the journalist has intelligence or evidence to give to law enforcement. And again, as I said a little bit earlier, in my experience, particularly in the International Corruption Unit, and I will give a little bit of context to this. Prior to the time that I was in the International Corruption Unit of the FBI, and again, that unit does our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigations. So, a U.S. person or company listed on the U.S. stock exchange is prohibited from paying bribes outside the United States. Those are the cases where we have our kleptocracy cases, these huge, massive money laundering cases where, a government official in a foreign country uses the U.S. financial system to transfer illegal proceeds out of its country. So 1MBD is an example of those cases, and then our antitrust cases. Prior to me working in that unit in 2015, I had very little interaction with journalists, even on major stories. And that was simply because, while we had a policy that allowed for on-background discussions, I had been taught, and my law enforcement officers, my law enforcement officer training in the FBI, had taught me that you don't talk to journalists at all, and that if you are going to talk to a journalist, that should be regulated through your press office. And the perfect example that I had of an interaction with a journalist where, I basically, had to say, I'm sorry, no comment, was at 9/11. When 9/11 occurred, I was sent to Boston, Massachusetts in the United States to conduct interviews at a hotel where some of the terrorists who had downed the planes in New York City had stayed the night before. And when I arrived, nobody was there but myself and the other agent who was there to conduct the interviews. We go into the hotel. We weren't there more than 25 or 30 minutes, and I came out of the hotel and there was about 40 journalists all standing around me yelling at me questions. And my response was no comment. Call the FBI office in Boston and speak to the press officer. So my interactions and my teaching was you did not engage with journalists even off the record. But like I said, when I came into the International Corruption Unit, that changed in part because journalists were doing these, very, expansive stories about, about kleptocrats. And that was right in the work that I took on when I came into the International Corruption Unit. And so what I found is that journalists were coming to law enforcement wanting to give information about their stories. And so how are we going to regulate those, those conversations? So, looking at number 3 here, journalists providing intelligence or evidence to law enforcement, there's a few rules to understand about that going into it. Number 1, when, like Walter said, law enforcement can accept what you provide, but in general, they cannot task you to collect intelligence or evidence once it's provided. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a particular example that I have. So what that means is you come to Walter and you give him your information. Walter can take everything that you have, but he can't tell you to go and collect or get particular piece of evidence or intelligence for him to use in his investigation. So it is a one-way street when you're in that position. But number 2, should you decide to be the person who provides intelligence or evidence to law enforcement, you should be cautious, especially in some of the countries that you come from, because by providing that intelligence or evidence, potentially you make yourself a witness in any investigation that comes from that intelligence or evidence, or even an ongoing, investigation. And unfortunately, in some countries, including Ukraine, what we've seen happening is when journalists provide that information to law enforcement, journalists become the target of law enforcement for providing that information. I won't go into the particulars of that, but those of you who are familiar with Ukraine are familiar with the case that I'm talking about. And so understand when you're providing that material to law enforcement that you need to be incredibly cautious. And that's why the better method and way to do that really is to go through a third party like an NGO or a civil society organization. Just so in full disclosure, that is what I do now. Part of what I do now in retirement is that I act as the kind of, we would say, the protected wall between law enforcement and journalists on taking their reporting as a civil society organization and turning around and turning it into something that is usable by law enforcement. Because, even though, Walter got your information in the example, a journalist's information, Walter still had to, have enough to start a case, so, in order to open a case. B, he had to validate that journalist's information. So he couldn't just take it, as we discussed in, our previous courses, and turn around and put the journalist, newspaper article in the file and say, I'm opening a case. But the other issue is, a lot of times, civil society, in my experience, would come with a journalist reporting and say, well, here's the journalist reporting. And what I tell civil society is that better to, add some value to that, to make it much clearer, for law enforcement to see that there's not only potentially a crime that they could investigate, but that they're the right agency to conduct the investigation. So what I strongly suggest is that if a journalist really feels like they have something that they want to share with law enforcement, is to work with a civil society, a reputable civil society organization, to provide that to law enforcement. So, I titled this "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly." So we've kind of talked about the good. We've talked about, well, there can be some bad, but what is the ugly, and why is this, an incredibly important discussion? And the ugly is this. So AP, of course, is the Associated Press, highly reputable news organization in the United States who has reporters all around the world. And this is a title from a news article, admittedly not a particularly well-respected news organization, but still some journalists did do this report. And the title is "AP Acted as DOJ FBI Agents to Push Criminal Prosecution of Trump Associate." So I have purposely X'd out the name of the person here. You probably could find this if you go look for it. But this is what happened in terms of an interaction between law enforcement and journalists, where the journalists wanted to provide intelligence or evidence to DOJ and the FBI. In order to further, or in order to encourage the FBI and DOJ to conduct an investigation or further an ongoing investigation. And so in the article, the journalist alleges that the AP was giving information regarding an individual by the name of Paul Manafort. Some of you are familiar with him, but look at the third line there. It says the AP acted as agents of the Department of Justice and the FBI to push the criminal probe into Paul Manafort, who served as our current president's campaign manager for several months, including giving information about his work in Ukraine, as well as the code to Manafort's private storage locker. And where did this information come from? Well, it came from a Freedom of Information request that was made by an organization, a civil society organization called Judicial Watch. And they found this information in the documents that they were able to obtain through that request. And those documents were what we call a report of investigation, a different type, not a 302. But the meeting, as you can see, which occurred about April 11th, 2017, was supposed to be off the record. In full disclosure, and for everybody here, why I pulled this information up is because I was one of the FBI agents who was at that meeting. And I actually was one of the people who wrote one of those reports that documented that interaction. And why? Because the meeting was supposed to be about the AP providing us evidence or intelligence to open an investigation against Paul Manafort. What the AP, of course, didn't know, and nobody knew, because the FBI does not comment on open investigations, is that we already had an ongoing investigation against Paul Manafort in April 2017. And I was not present for the second meeting where the discussion of the code to the storage locker occurred. But it is a caution to any journalist to understand that when you come to the FBI in that particular situation, which is what they said they wanted to do, which was provide us evidence, I, as the FBI agent at the time, had to do a report. And not only was that report turned over, in a FOIA request, that report also, when Paul Manafort was charged with a crime, was turned over to his defense counsel. And his defense counsel allowed Paul Manafort to see that report. And his defense counsel, although they are not supposed to, of course, shared that report with another journalist organization, which I'll not name. So this report, which came out in 2019, was actually based on this Judicial Watch request. There were previous news reports by other organizations about this interaction between the Associated Press, DOJ, and the FBI. And so, having been on the other side of this at the time, and having present an attorney with me who made it very clear to the Associated Press that that interaction had to be documented, it was a huge risk on the part of the Associated Press, to approach the FBI and provide this information. They, of course, having been present at the first meeting, they, of course, wanted in exchange something from the FBI, which, of course, we couldn't give them, which was they wanted to know, they wanted, evidence to further their own investigation into Paul Manafort. But of course, again, the FBI doesn't work that way. It's a one-way street. So, so they walked away without the other side of it. But they accepted a huge risk in coming to us the way they did. But legally, I, as the agent, had to document that meeting, and those interactions were turned over, in a couple of different ways. So that ends the discussion about, journalists as sources. You see where we are. I see another number of comments. Are there any questions?
No, not really questions related to the subjects which you just discussed, but to announce to everybody who was not following the chat messages, we will have the recording of this webinar available for those who are registered, and those who are interested in getting a certificate after attending both webinars would be able to receive it. And thank you, Karen. Thank you, all panelists, for this very honest discussion about what is possible, what is not possible for interaction between law enforcement and investigative journalists and civic activists. I think that it is really the first step to build a bridge between the work of law enforcement and investigative journalists, and would help to understand better the work of each other and the work of this time. It's mostly for investigative journalists to understand the work of law enforcement and limitations that they experience, and why the cooperation is not always moving forward. The only thing I wanted to mention, there was a case to which Karen was referring, and as a result of negative interaction of law enforcement in Ukraine, there was a court decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which said that when law enforcement tried to get a cell phone of investigative journalists, but they said that they can use it as an evidence in a criminal case, the court simply said that it was not okay to get a cell phone with all the messages, all the information, and that it was an overstep. Thank you all.